Hello, welcome to Excavations here at Varn blog with Jordan and Derick Varn. Should probably put how you find me on the fucking Twitter on here. You can find me at @SkepPoet. I think my current name is The Past is a Grotesque Angel of History, which is a double reference. But
deep cut.
Yeah. Yes.
Mine is my 19-year-old self's conception of a good play on my name, which is spelling it out. I don't know. I don't stand behind that. And yet it is.
I'm so glad Twitter did not exist when I was 19 years old.
Yeah.
I mean, SkepPoet is actually like my first blog from like 2005 or 6. My first public blog. I had blogs on LiveJournal that were private before that. But anyway, we're talking about Hal Draper and the history of Trotskyism, not my social media life, which is 21. My social media life could drink at this point.
That's awesome.
Oh God, what a depressing future we live in. Oh.
The grim darkness of the 21st century.
Supposed to have flying cars, and instead I got Twitter and TikTok bans. Anyway,
at least the ban. I mean, kind of something.
All right, so we are reading, and we are about 1/4 of the way. Well, no, we're not. We're about 1/5 of the way through of Hal Draper's 1947 essay, "The Inevitability of Socialism: The Meaning of a Much Abused Formula," and we are now in the section called "Socialism or Barbarism."
Finally.
Yeah, so we have gotten past the Trotsplaining that I had to do about the 50-something Trot sects or something. I've gotten past the basic epistemological frameworks that Draper is playing with, and we're now into the kind of political implications of those frameworks to some degree, and particularly on the socialism or barbarism stance.
Sure.
So we have to talk about the Fourth International. The Fourth International is a Trotskyist international, which the Trotskyists put out themselves once the Third International, or the Comintern, was abolished by Stalin at the late 1930s.
And we talked about that one last time.
Right. So this is the Fourth International. There have been at least 4 Fourth Internationals, confusingly.
Seriously?
Because different people have tried to revive it after Trotsky's death. So
fantastic.
So it gets funnier over time. For those of you who want to follow the depressing story of that, the regrettable century kid Stefan Hamill of The Measures Taken and I are doing a long explainer series on what the hell was American Trotskyism anyway, and why did it die so recently, seemingly after its relevance should have ended in 1992.
No offense,
well, I mean,
but
it really doesn't make sense for the major tradition of the left opposition to out-survive what it was the opposition of.
Can't argue with that.
All right, back to socialism or barbarism. The Fourth International has in its foundation presented the great alternatives of our epoch: socialism or barbarism. Trotsky did not invent that phrase either. That, I believe, goes back to Luxembourg.
Oh.
Without a socialist revolution, it was definitely part of the French Trotskyist movement, for sure, before it was part of the American.
Maybe not that exact wording, but I'm pretty sure that he quotes something from the manifesto, which is very similar, at least. But anyway,
no. It's not... It's not unheard of in like going all the way back to Marx.
Right.
Anyway, this is from the founding conference document of the Fourth International. Without a socialist revolution in the next historical period, at that, a catastrophe threatens the whole culture of mankind. The capitalist world is mortally wounded. Its agony, it exalts the poisons of fascism and totalitarian war, which threatens the subject to subject the workers and farmers everywhere once more to a new and horrible servitude and unleash the forces of destruction which will shatter modern civilization. Humanity can be saved from the new barbarism that menaces it only under the leadership of the revolutionary working class. Now, this is interesting because there's actually some very subtle inter-Bolshevik polemics here. Mentioning of workers and farmers together goes back to the Bolshevik innovation over the Second International and the Comintern, all the way back to like 1917.
Okay.
Of the dictatorship of the worker and peasant. In the New World context, we don't talk about peasants. And a lot of Trotskyism is actually based not just... Trotskyism's big bases were France, Britain, the United States, to some degree Mexico, and then Argentina, and the South America was a big part of it. So a lot of the Bolshevik conceptions are maintained, but actually kind of broader language is used to include more people, because we know that like we can't, it's really hard to talk about peasants in a US context or even some of the Latin American contexts. So in the leadership of the revolutionary working class is actually Trotsky's position that peasants should not be part of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that to include them was a Bukharinite mistake. Even though the dictatorship of the proletarian peasant was a formulation made by Lenin, Trotsky doesn't like to point that out.
And the other Fourth Internationals, do they take a similar position?
It becomes more and more about the worker.
Right.
So that the introduction Congress of the Fourth International in 1938 is in the context of the beginning of the World War. And it's in the context of, the Comintern, the Third International being closed, because while the Trotskyists were kicked out of the Comintern, they maintained it was legitimate as long as it existed. They saw themselves as the left opposition to the Comintern, and they were like they maintained that they should belong to it. They were unfairly kicked out, but that they were still loyal to the Communist International and the program of 1918, which is the Bukharin Presavinsky, I can't say Russian names, but program which is often called the ABCs of communism.
Right. When he says that in the next historical period, when Trotsky says this in the very beginning of that quote, do you think that Draper believes that he's in that next historical period, or that's something that's still to come?
Okay, so this is an interesting thing in 1947. Almost all the communists, including the Marxist-Leninist official communism of Stalin and later Khrushchev, actually maintained that the final crisis that was supposed to happen in the 1950s, in the 1920s, the end of the 1920s, that led to the Great Depression, was going to finally come back at the end of the war. And what happens is it doesn't. All right. If you read what's called the transitional program, or I believe it's like the actual name of the transitional program is actually kind of funny, because it makes a prediction based off this, that in the 50s that capitalism is going to end because of the incoming final crisis. All right. And he made that prediction pretty much concurrent with this thing here of the founding conference of the Fourth International. The transitional program is actually called the mobilization of the masses around the transitional man to prepare for the conquest of power.
God damn. The death agony of capitalism and the tasks of the Fourth International. That's another one that I found. Death agony. That's
the original publication of that thing is the death agony of capitalism, which is like, and so one of the things that is interesting about that, the reason why it's socialism or barbarism is because they are predicting capitalism is done already. All right.
Important to note for the rest of this reading.
Yeah, this is going to make things more complicated. And one of the things that I've told you is one of the reasons I think, excuse me, dealing with my flock of seagulls here right now.
It ran so far away from your head.
One of the things that I think is actually going on in this time period, and why we don't like to deal with it, is so many communist organizations make predictions that turn out to be false. The others, in response to that, what the theory that comes up in the late 50s, 1960s, is the monopoly capital, which says that the contradictions of capitalism have been solved, but the workers have been inculcated in what you have now as a monopoly capital, where the state and capital are basically one thing. That happens during what we call Fordism. That's the original Marxist attempt to theorize what that is, and why the final crisis didn't happen.
Okay.
It's interesting now that when people go to come up with, like, new class theories or whatever for what's going on today, they actually tend to go to this time period. And interestingly, it was actually one of the disciples of Trotsky who defected around 1939, James Burnham, who talked about how capitalism, as we understood it, had already morphed from entrepreneurial capital to managerial capitalism, and that there was no real difference between the administrative apparatus of any of these states.
Yeah.
He writes The Managerial Revolution and the New Machiavellians, and then later becomes like, he basically is one of the founding members of the CIA, of the OSS, later on. So that's also where the whole Trotskyism leads to neo-conservatism comes from. Is
really, that's like the root of it.
It's the root of it. Is Burnham, and then Burnham actually actively recruiting, under the guidance of George Kennan, a bunch of people who were associated with Trotskyist movements around the Partisan Review to the Congress of Cultural Freedom in the 1950s, people like Sidney Hook and whatnot.
Okay,
so,
and he's coming up at the end of our reading.
Yes, he is, and it's a lot of these names that come up. We actually have to I have to point out are but by today's standards are not considered like Marxists. They're considered defectors. It's important to bring it out because we have to remember this is written in 1947.
Sure.
Even though Draper's associated with like 1968 in 1969 in America pretty hard, he starts his career polemicizing like in World War II. So
right, that's why this text is also such a fascinating read for what holds water, what doesn't, and then how it measures up against his later works.
Yeah. All right, so that, to get past that first bit there.
Yes.
And much more to the same effect. Our mechanistic dominants, such as the SWPs, that's the Trotskyist party, the one that's descended from this conference. Theoretician Ward J.R. Johnson and his disciples cannot make heads or tails of this concept. Since it is written into the books by Trotsky himself, it obviously is immune from overt attack. But it cannot be fitted into the ritual. The same is true with the record in the Communist Manifesto, which poses alternatives of class struggle ending in either revolutionary constitution of society at large or in the common ruin of contending classes.
There you go. The long-winded version of socialism or barbarism.
Right. And completely bewildering to these muscle-bound Marxists was Trotsky's bombshell in the USSR and War, where he speaks of the historical alternative carried to the end as either socialism or totalitarian bureaucratic slave society, if the world proletariat should actually prove incapable of fulfilling the mission placed on it by the course of development. This is why some people actually, even some non-Trotskyists, pick up the techno-feudalism argument, is there were people who predicted that we were going to regress back to some bureaucratic feudal society through the developments of higher level capitalism. That was also part of the monopoly capital debates too. We will discuss presently the impermissible pessimistic conclusion which he draws from this later possibility. What is of interest now is that Trotsky freely speaks of historical alternatives and discusses our degree of certainty. In his follow-up article in Defense of Marxism, Trotsky sharpens the point. This is Trotsky quote, and I'll read all of it. It's long, sorry. Good old Trotsky here.
Tell me if you get tired.
Some comrades were surprised that I spoke in my article, The USSR and War, of a system of bureaucratic collectivism as a theoretical possibility. This is where it comes from. Remember I said that Trotsky doesn't adopt this position, but Trotsky is the origin of it?
Yes.
This is an apparent misunderstanding. The Marxist comprehension of the historical necessity has nothing in common with fatalism. Socialism is not realizable by itself as a result of the struggle of living forces, classes, and their parties. Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The proletariat's decisive advantage and struggle resides in the fact that it represents historical progress, while the bourgeoisie incarnates reaction and decline. Precisely in this is the source of our conviction and victory. But we have full right to ask ourselves, what character will society take if the forces of reaction conquer? Marxists have formulated an incalculable number of times the alternative, either socialism or the return to barbarism. After the Italian experience, in double quotation marks because we're within a quote,
yes,
we repeat thousands of times, either communism or fascism. The real passage to socialism cannot fail to appear incomparably more complicated, more heterogeneous, more contradictory than was foreseen in the general historical scheme. Marx spoke about the dictatorship of the proletariat and its future withering away, but said nothing about bureaucratic generation of the dictatorship. We have observed and analyzed for the first time in the experience of such a generation. Is this a revision of Marxism? What social and political forms can this new barbarism take? If we admit theoretically that mankind should not be able to elevate itself to socialism, we have the possibility of expressing ourselves on the subject more completely than Marx. Fascism, on one hand, is a degeneration of a Soviet state on the other, outline the social and political forms of neo-barbarism. An alternative of this kind, socialism or totalitarian servitude, has not only theoretical interest, but also enormous importance in agitation, because in its light, the necessity for social revolution must appear most graphically. And I find it funny that a lot of people think that totalitarian was invented by Americans just as an anti-communist phrase, because we find it here in Trotsky in 1938, when the United States was not doing anti-communism.
Someone just said that really recently. Yeah. Well, there you go.
Yeah, they're usually... It was picked up and adopted by anti-communists immediately, but it's not. Its origins are not actually there. A lot of leftists repeat a lot of things that aren't true that they heard online once.
Oops!
And then have trouble dealing with, when they actually are confronted with it before they were told it existed. So my favorite example is people always talking about how slave catchers are the origins of all police, and I'm like, the first constable actually is the first constable that we know of is actually in the British occupation of Ireland.
I mean, also we know the term Bobby for Brits as well.
Yeah, but that's a later term.
Oh, it's later then? Okay.
Yeah.
Fine. Fair enough. Well, I have a few questions about this section.
So I will say one of the reasons why we tend to blame it on anti-communism is because totalitarianism is used by people like Karl Popper to lump Plato, Hitler, Hegel, Marx, everybody doesn't like, into one category, and then Arendt kind of uses it the same way.
Interesting. Except like people who have like a theory of everything in that way.
Yeah. Okay. As opposed to the open free market capitalist society, which Popper supposedly, and that popularization was explicitly anti-communist, but it gets used before that. Anyway, so back to this.
Wait, my question.
Okay, question.
Sure. All right, I have a number, so let's see what we're gonna do here. In this section on socialism or barbarism from Trotsky, What does Draper mean when he references Trotsky's quote here, the impermissibly pessimistic conclusion, which he draws from the latter possibility regarding the failure or incapability of the proletariat to fulfill its mission? Is it like still impermissible, unthinkable, and terribly pessimistic today to
No,
consider?
I think it's something we have to consider because at this point, the proletariat has not lived up to its mission.
Does he put like an expiration date on this in
No,
terms
that's
of?
the thing. That's the thing with Marx. Marx doesn't. But Marx thought the revolution after 1848, he thought the revolution was imminent because of financial crisis in the 1850s.
Sure.
And a lot of ways people think from his letters, people being like the new Marx lecture people, that what actually prompted him to write Capital was to explain why he was wrong.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Oh, that's weird. Is this like talk of pessimism and optimism even something that's particularly
I don't think
relevant?
it's helpful at all.
Right. I mean, it's
Uh,
terribly normative as well, and it's like a psychological stance more than anything else.
Correct. I mean, I actually kind of take the Mark Davis, I mean, not Mark Davis, Mike Davis stance on it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like talking about pessimism or optimism has nothing to do with when and how you need to fight or whether or not you're even likely to win.
Right. I mean,
Like,
because pessimism sounds like something which is paralyzing, and optimism sounds like something which is like very complacent. Neither
right.
of those things really lead to praxis, which is,
Sure.
part of this comment as well.
One thing that we have to talk about, there's another subtlety in this, is this a revision of Marxism? And that's a reference to the revisionist debates. I have an episode coming up about that too. Pro Cult Films is also doing something, and you can read the book Marxism After Marx for what was actually the historical context for those debates. But that was an attempt by Edward Bernstein, who was Engels' friend. Engels was closer to Bernstein than he was to Kautsky. To revise what they thought was necessary for socialism, and Bernstein basically comes up with a thesis that's later kind of echoed by the conservative thinker Joseph Schumpeter, that like socialism's kind of inevitable through democratic processes anyway.
Sure. Okay. Interesting.
So that's what the revisionist controversy is about, whether or not socialism is inevitable without class struggle.
That's the thing. That was my next question. Exactly. Like, who has described socialism as realizable, quote, by itself without struggle?
Bernstein thought that the struggle would just be through the democratization of the state. Like, so he didn't think it was without struggle. But he also said it couldn't be done by the proletarian alone because they weren't a big enough part of the population. That's what led it. And this was at a time when the industrial proletariat got, I think, to about 42% in Germany. At no time has the industrial working class actually been the majority of the population.
Was he thinking then of including like class traders more, or farmers and peasants?
It was more that to make capitalism work, there would have to be more and more state control, because while the bourgeoisie would need to be subjugated to the plurality of the population, which would be the working class, they couldn't totally do it alone.
Right.
That's different from, say, the corporatist or fascist conception that all the classes need to work together, but you can kind of see how they're related. Interestingly enough, though, when we talk about the right of the SPD, if you like Ebert and whatnot, and then the people who defected and became fascist, even like I believe Werner Sonnenpart was in the SPD. I've gotten conflicting stuff on who was in the SPD when, depending on sources, and now so I'm gonna like try to look at German sources because they're probably going to be better. But anyway, the right of the SPD actually, interestingly, were not part of the Bernstein people, they actually thought that Bernstein was wrong, but they thought that the national subject and national cooperation would be the subject of the revolutionary change, and so that sort of leads to fascism. In the Italian context, which I know you're about to ask about,
How?
maybe you've sent me your questions ahead of time.
Maybe.
In Italy, there exists no alternative. I'm just going to actually ask the question. I'm not going to read it for you. This is George's question. She should ask it.
Damn it. In Italy, from our historical vantage, did there really exist no alternative beyond communism and fascism? Looking back, like what other historical alternatives have we seen in global history since as well? And further, what might neo-barbarism look like in 2023? You already touched a little bit on this concept of falling back, if into something reactionary and regressive, then we could consider potentially neo-feudalism, technocratic neo-feudalism. But
Yeah,
that's not moving me so much.
I'm not sure technocratic neo-feudalism is coherent, but like a rentier state is actually a different kind of capitalism. Finance capitalism is a different focus of capitalism. Still capitalism, sure. Still operates under the same underlying basic dynamic in regards to valorizing formal capital, but it's not like, it doesn't operate the same kind of productive dynamic, etc. And thus all this fear about like bureaucratic collective slavery.
That's the only part that ever appealed to me, and then it became rather apparent that that's not actually any sort, neither a regression or like a mutation of capital. It's just an element of it.
Yeah,
it's status quo maintenance.
Well, I mean, bureaucratic collectivism and enforced labor would actually be a different kind of capitalism.
Sure, but saying I mean to say like what we can actually notice as potentially true about that theory.
All right. So in Italy, was there no alternative between fascism and communism? Well, one thing that
what
we
else
have
was
to
going
look
on
at,
there?
Italy did not have the kind of currency pool to pull the other option, which was Keynesian and Keynesian Fordist social democracy / social compact in the United States, because it was privatized largely.
Okay.
That was not possible in Italy because they didn't have the developed resources, because they unified as a country too late. Even though Marx puts the foundation of capitalism in the Italian city-states, like they were not actually particularly strong capitalist countries. You don't really have a strong one until England.
Sure, that's why he kind of skips over the Mediterranean case and goes straight to England.
I mean, that's also where he was and where he had the economic data for. But sure, yes,
that's probably also a really good point. Yes.
But I mean, this leads to a debate between the political Marxists who come out of Trotskyism too, actually, and I told you there was kind of a three-way debate in the 70s between like the world systems theory Marxists, the political Marxists, that's Robert Brenner, Ellen Milkins Woods, who's dead now, kind of classical Marxists like Neil Davidson, and world systems theory people like Wallerstein, who'd taken the world systems theory of the French historians like Brundal. I don't know how to say the name. It's Braudel.
Okay.
And Marxified it.
There you go.
And that led to Giovanni Arrighi's work and Emmanuel Wallerstein's work, and the work of Samir Amin out of Egypt. And it's interesting as like Brenner's the only one of these people who's still alive now. Everybody else is dead. Although their books, they were all publishing books well into the 2010s. So so there's plenty of material here. And some of the old school analytic Marxists are still alive, but they're like in their 80s. But most of them are dead or have defected. I don't know about Romer and Elster, but I know that like I can't say the name. We practiced it the other day on a patrons only podcast.
I learned how to pronounce Polish specifically for this reason, and now I can't remember his name.
Spiswowski. Fuck it.
What was the name again of the book that he wrote?
Capitalism and Social Democracy.
And Social Democracy?
Yeah.
Jaworski.
Spivorsky. All right.
Exactly.
I don't think they're Marxist anymore, even of the analytical time. Elster and Romer, I don't know. Eric Olin Wright remained a Marxist, but he died a few years ago. In fact, most of the generation of people that we think of as like as the key Marxist thinkers,
yeah,
they're all dead. They've all died recently. So we've lost Leo Panich, and we've lost Barbarian Reich, and we've lost Mike Davis, and we've lost all the world systems people, Giovanni Righi, Emmanuel Wallerstein. Emmanuel Wallerstein was like 80 something, so don't feel too bad about it. But like,
we still have Cockshot wilding out on Twitter.
He's not part of that generation.
Okay, that makes sense.
But he is very old. I mean,
he's 71. I mean, yeah,
right.
That's what, like 10 years difference.
But the econophysicist people of which he is vaguely associated come later.
Okay.
But basically now, most of our Marxist theoreticians who came out of these debates are all dead. And the way to, and one of the reasons why I am talking about this is increasingly there's a whole lot of stuff is being asserted as like historical Marxist positions that I just like, no, they're not. We never talked about any of this shit, and you aren't talking about what we did talk about. Multipolarity is part of like we talked about. Like that's English geopolitics. Doesn't say any, like, it's neither good or bad. It's just a descriptor.
Exactly.
Of the how many hegemons there are at a particular time.
Right.
But
did you see that Zizek, like, by the way, just published in Compact about this?
Yes.
Yes, of course.
Anyway, to get at to just say that the whole woke versus anti-woke Marxist debate that we currently see would make our intellectual forebetters vomit.
Oh my
God. Hal Draper was not wasting time on that shit.
No.
And neither was Samir Amin. So,
and anyway, for what he was spending time on, he had like much better verbiage and quips than just woke and being, obsessed with the wrong thing. I've been loving reading this essay, by the way. He writes so well.
Yeah, Draper's great. Draper's
he's also one of the only people that you can really read like a sarcastic tone into without, getting confused or wondering.
Yeah, Draper's great, and Draper's, like I said, he's interesting. Only has a BA. That's back when everything wasn't dominated by academics.
Sure.
But he's super rigorous. And I would tell everybody, read his 5-volume books, Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, because until the new Marx lecture stuff from Germany, it was the best stuff. Because this guy spent apparently a whole lot of damn time when he was working at the library at Berkeley.
Yeah.
Just reading all the Marx letters that were available in English.
Wow. I mean, which wasn't so many at the time, but still.
But it was still a fair amount. So like... And he constructed a pretty good intellectual biography. So like, let's look at how Karl Marx's thought developed based off of like what little bits of the MAGA that we had available to the MAGA one that we had available to us in the 1950s and 60s. And he worked on it until he died in the 1990s. So like, read it. It's good. Anyway, back to this.
Yes.
So was there other things? I don't think in Italy there was. Like I think you either had a socialist problem, like they didn't have the capacity to compete with the other major capitalist powers, and so they needed something to do that. And you have to remember that the other capitalist powers like have an imperial edge on them. We're talking about the settler colonial capitalist powers, aka mostly the United States, and to a lesser degree Canada and Mexico. You're talking about France, which has a fucking massive empire, Spain and Portugal, which had massive empires that they faded, and Germany, which wanted an empire and couldn't get one, and also had like Italy had only recently fully constituted as a coherent nation, and Britain, which was like the biggest empire even then. So when you think about that in that context, a lot of what he's saying makes sense. I don't think it's a mistake, other than just their side in World War One, which also, of course, that's important.
Sure.
But why fascism particularly comes to power in Germany and Italy, because they're consolidated nation states that are close to the cores of capital, but aren't actually in them and don't actually have an empire. They both try to, but it fails.
What about like what role did, or what position rather, I guess, did the Catholic Church in Italy take with regards to fascism at this
First
time?
hostile and then conciliatory.
Interesting. Very good. Just a note, by the way, for people who are listening, I watched a really cool series very, very recently, based on a book by Carlo Levi called Christ Stopped at Eboli, which was about his year and a half of internal exile as a communist from Turin and Piemonte, who was sent down into the southern Italy. And it was really fascinating. It was a really interesting look of a period of 1945 in Italy during fascism as a communist.
So interesting about Catholic social thought is fascism is not something that is inevitable from Catholic social thought, but you can see how fascism is, in its integralism and corporatism, is easily incorporated with Catholic social thought, because it emphasizes the cooperation of classes, which is something that Catholic social thought really imposes. And at least formally, Catholic social thought in the beginning of the 20th century opposed both capitalism and socialism by dictate, as stated by Pius IX.
Okay.
Pio Nono. So so after Pio Nono makes that declaration that the Catholic social thought is opposed to both social capitalism and communism and socialism, as modernist deviations, basically, that fascism, which they opposed initially as being too much like socialism and capitalism, eventually, probably for cynical reasons, because Mussolini starts taking a conciliatory stance to like protecting the Vatican and shit, towards fascism. It's even more complicated in the German case, however, because while Hitler is all over the place on religion, it's pretty clear that Nazism had, I think, more pull amongst the Protestant end of the German like areas than it did in the Catholic end. One of the interesting things I discovered in a book, just a little small book on Kevin Passmore called a very short introduction to fascism. It points out that the communists did pretty well with unemployed Catholics in Germany.
Interesting.
Which, is interesting, because historically communists are associated with Jews, and they were in Germany too, but they actually did pretty okay with people from Catholic families and Catholic part of the country, probably because they had a higher tendency to be unemployed. It's
right, and unemployed Jews were not from the working class for the most part.
Yeah, so
this is also like an interesting spin on the concept of like what barbarism can mean if we actually have a religious element in both sides, if it's fascism, Italian or German Nazism and all of that. Like, I think there's this more modern concept that people of faith, especially who tend to be conservative, are not going to be taken by the draw of fascism. And we have a historical concept here. Like, that's not true.
It's not true.
Actually, it doesn't give you a better structure for your life or idea of how to behave necessarily.
No,
and
not at
I'm
all.
hearing this a lot recently, actually, and it's kind of troubling.
I pointed this out about the secularization of religion, like since basically capitalism existed, religious forces' ability to offer real alternatives to it have mostly been concessionary.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes sense because they survive off the same social surplus that everybody else does.
Sure.
So why am I saying, like, so when people are like, oh, well, religion can fight fascism, it might be able to if it's strong, but it's not strong anywhere right now. An interesting thing is, though, I will say with Christians is people historically think Christians tend to be direly anti-communist. They do, usually after the revolution, but for example, in the Korean case, the Christians tended to support the Korean Communist Party until the Korean Communist Party started suppressing them, and then they ran to Seoul. So, like, it's not always clear where any of these religious groups are actually going to go.
Sure.
For a variety of reasons, particularly when you deal with multi-religious, multi-ethnic states, as opposed to single religious states, which is what you deal with in France and England.
Right.
So, picking this back up.
Yes.
Blah 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 blah. Well, you have one more question, but we haven't got to that yet. Note that here is not a question of equal possibility. This refers to Trotsky's quote that we talked about 15 minutes ago, which is a term dragged in neither by Trotsky nor the Workers' Party. It is a question simply of the existence of historical alternatives. This is why Trotsky in this passage, and we emphasize only in the light of these historical alternatives, the struggle for social revolution take meaning, and most graphically, so when the alternative to socialist victory is a slave state, as already outlined by the decomposition of modern society. I don't know. One of the things that I would say is I don't know that we know that the only answer to the problems of capitalism is a slave state. But historically speaking, we have more slave states than not, so it's not a super bad assumption.
It's just maybe calling back onto the regressive tendency more than
right. It
else.
is, and this is why Marx was so interested in the American Civil Wars. He was afraid that there would be a form of capitalism that could incorporate regressive elements of prior modes of production, i.e. chattel slavery,
Sure.
and maybe actually compete. He was not as certain that it would not be profitable. And as new studies have shown, it led to a lot of the accumulation of capital itself. That's the new slavery history stuff. What I will say in that regard, it was also not clear by slavers if they were capitalist or not. There was big debates about that. Fitzvogel, who's the guy who wrote a sociology for the South, which unfortunately is the first guy to use the word sociology in English.
God.
You made an argument that was pro-slavery because it wasn't capitalism.
Yes. Oh God. Maybe rethink that.
Yeah. So that was argued by both sides, and there were also pro-slavery factions who thought they were capitalists. So it's like it was unclear even to the people on the pro-slavery side whether or not they were participating in the same system as the rest of capitalism. All right. Anyway, back to this. It is our conviction that the socialist revolution will triumph. There is no question of equal possibility. But this conviction is based on the examination of evidence, in the first place, upon the Marxist analysis of social forces at work, the truth of which, like all human truths, is tested and confirmed only in practice and in struggle. This is a dialectical argument, like the truth of something is only proven by its viability in actually surviving and socially persisting.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just good enough that something is factually correct. It also must be factually correct and viable. If it's not viable, then I mean it's superficially true, but it doesn't matter.
And we know it's viable because it's been proven to be so in like a realistic manifestation.
Meaning we know that someone's actually done it.
Yeah.
And in like, so when we talk about historical alternatives, which are not questions of facticity, their truth or not is actually settled by history.
Right.
Like,
It's not
who
just
wins?
theoretical or logical consistency. It's like empirical evidence.
Right.
Okay.
But that again is about the facticity of like of truth claims I mean, it's about the truth criterion of things beyond facticity. So use facticity, meaning like we're not arguing about whether or not my shirt is blue, given the definition of blue that we all
Sure.
share. We're arguing about like that's a facticity statement. Like once we agree on the definition of blue, it either applies or it doesn't.
Right.
Right. Dialectics and materialist dialectics in particular assume that like if something is possibly true,
Mm-hmm.
it has to actually be socially reproducible, so it has to actually exist. The problem with this for communists now is like when communists argue that like, well, we know that like Stalin's Marxist-Leninism works versus Trotskyism. Well, if you're actually consistent with this, 1992 is a problem for both sides.
Sure.
Like it settles the question and they both lose.
Mm-hmm.
But whether or not it settles the question for Marxism is an open question still, because there's still all kinds of conditions that could still be at play. And this is one of the conservative arguments against Marxists that they have a hard time dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
When conservatives go, well, the working class didn't do what you said it was going to do. When's your criterion for saying that you were wrong? Because you're the group that claims you have one.
Yeah, but is it actually falsifiable?
Well, no, but then that's another problem for Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what these debates are really kind of about. Like, is the non-falsifiability of a normative claim a problem? And remember, one of the things that we all know is Marx and Hegel did want to make an argument that oughts and norms, so ises and shoulds, could eventually be collapsed.
Yeah.
All right. Which is something to British logic and the Anglo-American analytic tradition is a big no-no. All right. The fatalist view of inevitability. Oh, excuse me.
No, I think we can move on. That's fine. We kind of covered it in
it is not the conviction deduced from it's not a conviction deduced from a priori reasoning concerning determinism that is fully founded on a deterministic principle. Do we think that's a cop-out? Jordan, did that sound like a cop-out to you when you read it?
It sounds like a little bit of a cop-out. I mean, there's a little bit, specifically from this segment, that kind of, it feels cop-outy because he's like, well, this isn't really something that we should entertain, but we'll leave it for later. And then I'm just going to make a bunch of statements and claims, and we'll see.
Right.
But then he kind of like gets a little bit, I don't know, I don't want to say pedantic, but like he cares more about the semantic side of this in the following sections. So I don't know if it balances out eventually.
I just think it is not a conventional deduced from a priori reasoning. Okay, fine. Concerning determinism. Okay, fine. Though it's fully founded on deterministic principles. Damn it, I'm not.
Right.
And I'm like, so the adjective versus the adverb form is really important.
Exactly.
Like,
yeah, I guess like what interests me about this most is like what will Hal Draper go on to say in his later works about such claims.
It'll get more interesting, I think, when we read some of his later stuff.
Interesting.
Fatalist views of inevitability.
Let's do it. Or let's not be fatalist. I don't know. Let's find out.
we can now characterize the nature of the Johnson's formulation on the inevitability of socialism. It is fatalism, a species of imminent predestination or preordination. It has nothing in common with Marxism and dialectical materialism. Pushed to its logical end, which, to be sure, is too much to expect from its sponsors, its roots are dearly visible in idealism, as it is necessarily true of all varieties of fatalism. It may be objective that it may be objected that I have been up to now characterizing it as mechanical materialism. This is a well-known phenomenon in the Marxist analysis of philosophy, and far from being disconcerting, should have been expected. Mechanical materialism regularly turns into its opposite, idealism. This is a philosophical analog of the tendency of sectarianism to turn into its opposite, opportunism, on the political field. Which, I mean, I'm not actually sure this holds up as an argument,
I was
frankly,
going to ask about that
but
specifically
it's
as
a
well.
pretty good dig.
Yeah.
Well, this is based on the dialectical assertion, and this is kind of like very crude dialectics, that mechanical materialism a la Feuerbachian materialism. All right, to bring it back to our patrons only Kohei discussion,
which is rather good, if I might say so myself.
Is is actually still Hegelian idealism, because Feuerbach's materialism leads him to focus solely on ideas, even though his own notion of material development makes that nonsensical. That's the whole, like, my response to people like, well, humans are just automaton, everything is, there's no will at all. And I'm like, well, I don't believe in counter-causal free will, but the idea that there's no will at all and everything is inevitable going all the way back to the Big Bang kind of makes your even arguing with me about it irrelevant.
Exactly. And certainly anything that I'll say in response and anything that you'll say in response to that.
Back to this. So I think it's interesting what he's doing here. But it is something that goes back to Marx. He's not pulling that out of his ass. Like, sure. The Marx critique of Feuerbach is Feuerbach's materialism doesn't actually end up being material. It's.
What do you make for a second, though, of the excuse me, the claim of opportunism? Because that's interesting in the sectarian context.
Well, he's saying that, like, a lot of sects will claim to be, they'll claim to be absolutely rigidly dogmatically adherent to a program, and then the moment that they try to do anything, they actually tend to flip all those principles on their heads and give it up for an opportunistic claim, some kind of tailless move, etc. Which, as an observation, seems true enough. Like, I think about the people who critique the DSA. Of course, I am one of them, but who then say we need to go to these non-electoral groups who don't take orders from the Democratic Party. But what do? They join popular front groups that do NGO work with the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
So how are they actually more separate than DSR? They are, in a legal sense, they are. Like, although the DSA is not technically a part of the Democratic Party either, but, like, it's totally subordinated to that. It works with Democratic Party electeds. But in an actual day-to-day practice of a member, it's not that different, actually. So which of those is opportunistic? Well, they both are, frankly. Like, why are these people doing these activist things? Well, they're doing the activist things to get people interested in their organization. They're not just doing it out of the kindness of their heart. Some of the stuff they're pushing has nothing to do with their own party policy. So yeah, I think that's something to keep in mind, and I think that's true enough. Is it inevitably true? I don't know that that's inevitably true.
Sure.
It just happens a lot.
Interesting. So it's like an interesting comparison, but not necessarily an analog or entirely true.
Yeah.
Okay. Carry on.
So
there's one last sentence of this section, which is dialectical materialists reject this fatalist view of the inevitability of socialism formula. Its political meaning will be discussed later. Next.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Although I want to point out something pretty crucial here.
Sure.
Draper is arguing here off of the basic sectarian assumption that dialectical materialism is Marxist philosophy. And if you read Marx and Engels, like, there's a section in Anti-Düring that's labeled dialectical materialism or something.
Okay.
It's like section 3 of Anti-Düring was labeled that. It was labeled that by an editor. It's not actually the case in the German text. Marx and Engels never use that term. It's actually it comes up from a German guy, Danzen. I think that's how you say his name.
Sure.
and it gets picked up by Gorgy Plekhanov in the Soviet Union, and really gets nailed down by the Bolsheviks, but particularly in the 1938 book. So much of this happens in 1938, weirdly. Dialectical and historical materialism. But it's Deitzgen.
How is that spelled?
Dietzgen, and he was a Marxist.
DIE is D.
Dietzgen.
Dietzen?
Dietzen.
DIETZ.
Gen.
Dietzgen.
Dietzgen.
Yeah.
All right.
Or Dietzgen, I guess.
Thank you for reminding me how you actually pronounce German.
Yes.
Anyway, and he was a Marxist. In fact, he was one of the Marxists that actually like fought with Engels in 1848 and all that. So he's an old guard Marxist, but he's the person who coins the term. I just always point that out because there's debates, and I'm going to eventually cover them on my radical engagements, because I'm saving up a bunch of like 70s through aughts Marxology essays to kind of argue with. That says that dialectical materialism is not Marx or even Engels, and I'm like, well, the name isn't. Dietzgen actually did, however, know these guys.
Yeah.
He didn't pull it out of his ass.
Sure.
But they also never picked up the terminology themselves.
Where did the turning Hegel on its head come from? Is that a direct line from Marx, or?
Yeah, that's a direct line from Marx.
Do you remember where?
I think it's a critique of philosophy of right. If not, it might be a critique of Hegel's philosophy in general.
Okay, no, interesting.
Or maybe it was Lenin.
Interesting. I've always wondered about that one as well. I've come to be extra skeptical and questioning of claims of things that Marx said if I can't find the exact source.
Yeah, so it's I'm just looking it up. It's actually in the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844.
Oh, that makes sense.
All right.
For other reasons that we go into in our Sato discussion.
Right. And it's because I always forget, because like all the good critiques of Marx of Hegel are like not actually. I think the critique of Marx's the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right was published, but the critique of Hegel's philosophy in general was an abandoned essay that he doesn't release, and it's kind of a mess. Like, I've actually read it and I'm like, I don't know if this actually holds up. Anyway,
that's funny.
Trotsky's formulation. Okay. Before we turn to examine the inevitability of socialism does mean, this still is another interpretation we must note. If anything, it is the opposite of the Johnson concept, and at least topples over in its opposite direction. What's interesting here is he's kind of crypto accusing Johnson and the SWP of being like vulgar Marxist Leninist almost, although he's not doing it directly. Like, he's not willing to call them Stalinist, but he's definitely kind of implying that that's where their philosophy comes from.
Got you.
Anyway, we can get back up.
Sure.
Trotsky, for one, put it forward in passing in 1921, the first years of the Comintern, page 299. Holy fuck, did these people write a lot?
Yeah, I mean, also he's like quoting like 4 or 5 different sources of Trotsky within the 4 passages that we've reading here.
Yeah. Oh yeah. People used to know their shit more.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, he probably was pulling from the Berkeley Library, or actually, I don't know though.
No, this is before. I think he was before he worked there. Just the public.
This
library.
is just actually
he was like in Brooklyn.
No, he would have to be pulling this from collections of newspapers.
Sure,
and official
that's what
documents.
They were for the most part, right?
Yeah, he wouldn't even have access to this in a library. It would have been in the public library at the time.
Imagine like Trotskyist microfilms of the day.
Yeah, I mean,
Kept behind lock and key.
I think we forget that because we're all like, I can look this up real easy. This would not have been easy to look up.
No way.
All right. Anyway, in a very interesting passage, all the efforts of the bourgeoisie, all the energies expended by maintaining its class equilibrium, manifest themselves invariably at the expense of the economic soil on which the bourgeoisie rests, at the expense of the economic base. The bourgeoisie and the working class are just located on the soil which renders our victory inescapable, not in an astronomical sense, of course, not inescapable like setting and rising of the sun, but inescapable in a historical sense, and in the sense that unless we gain victory, all society and human culture is doomed. All right. Passage continues in a way which underlines the difference between this astronomical sense and the historic sense. History teaches us this. I'm reading Trotsky here.
Yes, another part of the first 5 years of the Comintern.
Yep. It is thus
continues. Yes.
It is thus that the ancient Roman civilization perished. The class of slave owners proved incapable of leading forward this development. Period. For me, I have been wondering about why the fuck capitalism didn't emerge out of the end of the antique Roman Empire for a long time, because all the technologies we consider and that necessary for capital, including the beginnings of banking, actually do exist in the 3rd century, but it doesn't happen. You have this breakdown into multiple imperial systems, multiple mayoral systems that we vaguely call feudalism. You have this kind of development of 3 or 4 concurrent codes of law. So you have laws enforced by a sovereign, but also law enforced by the church. And then this kind of like emergent law between sovereigns emerges too. And they're all based on private fealty. So that so basically, private fealty is what's driving this relationship. If you get really weird about it, there are libertarians who argue that feudalism is like the ultimate perfection of capitalism because it's a privatized state.
I guess I'll just add that I remember reading something in Capital One where Marx like briefly relates to this. I'm not sure how like deep he goes into it or if other people have done more to explain, but as far as I remember, it was something having to do with like the backwards movement, not people from farmland to cities, but from the city centers back into like a more pastoral setting. And that might be like the lack of alienation from land and movement into urban centers in
prior to the 18th to the 19th century, it was actually pretty common for human beings to go in and out of urban development, for societies to move
like seasonally, right?
Right, both seasonally and also for urban infrastructure to start falling apart so bad that people went back out into other forms of pastoral life. Like we talk about like the end of the Mayan Empire, it wasn't that the Mayans died, it was that people left the cities.
Okay. They also died a little bit.
Well, we don't know.
Yeah.
We actually don't. We don't have an evidence of like a mass slaughter. Right. And you know the Mayan languages are still spoken in those areas. So like, but they were not cohesive even before the Spanish came. Like they were those cities were already abandoned.
Interesting.
All right. Anyway,
yes.
There was no other class to supersede it, and ancient civilization perished. I think this is kind of a simplistic view on Trotsky's sake, but it's kind of true. We observe analogous occurrences in modern history too. As warriors of the revolution, we are convinced, and the objective facts corroborate us, that we as the working class, that we as a communist international will only save our civilization, the centuries old product of hundreds of generations, but will raise it to much higher levels of development. However, from the standpoint of pure theory, the possibility is not excluded that the bourgeoisie, armed with the state apparatus and its entire accumulated experience, may continue fighting the revolution until it has drained modern civilization of every atom of its vitality. until it has plunged mankind into a state of collapse and decay for a long time to come. This
I
is
like
something.
that little extra bit at the end there, for a long time to come. Even that's open-ended.
Right. So Trotsky's saying that, like, look, they may have won. Like, and in which case this battle will happen in some other future class society where some
Right.
other class will be able to pick up the mantle of class abolition. But at this point, it is an open question. All right. A lot of people don't want it to be an open question.
No. Well, no, I mean, if that's why we have this essay. I suppose.
Well, it's really kind of a huge deal because it's a debate that emerges over and over again in socialism.
Yeah.
The month before, Trotsky had expressed a similar thought. With the aid of these added state organs, which relation to the economic foundation represents a superstructure, the ruling class may perpetuate itself in power for years and decades after it has become a direct brake upon social development. If such a situation endures too long, an outlived ruling class can drag down those countries and peoples over whom it rules. Hence arises
the
the
necessity
necessity
of
of revolution. Otherwise, we wouldn't need it because it would happen anyway. I think what scares a lot of people now, who do understand the implications of this, and most Marxists no longer want to deal with the implications of this. So there is a real implication that, like, well, there is a possibility that traditional revolution isn't possible anymore, and thus, like, collapse is the only way possible. Then you have people like communization theorists who say, okay, sure, we're going to embrace collapse because then we can communize the future out of the collapse, right? So there's a lot of tendencies that are coming that we still kind of have now that haven't asserted themselves yet as political forces, as answers to these questions. And it wasn't just Trotsky asking them. However, Stalin just thought it was inevitable. Mao thought it was inevitable. And from standpoints of being in societies where they won, I guess it makes sense.
Sure.
The problem is they didn't win the worldwide battle. Now, we shall comment later on the sense of this passage. Right now, I'm mainly concerned with Trotsky's formulation. Inescapable in the historic sense, in the sense that unless we gain victory, all society and human culture is doomed.
Ending on doomed again. I love that. It's just really
inevitable alternatives.
Wait, I have questions for this section.
Okay, let's go.
Rather questiony. Sure. In the beginning of that section, Trotsky is talking about the bourgeoisie maintaining equilibrium, quote, at the expense of its economic base. Does this hold up within the framework of capitalism's elasticity, as we know?
Yes, it does. All right. Because you have, if you look at, for example, the productivity of capitalism, as measured by anything right now, it's declined in the since 2008, and it happens.
Real production, right?
Real production. I mean, productivity per hour per worker is declined.
Sure. Okay.
Real production and production of commodities has declined. Has profits declined? Not if profits are tied into rent. And one of the things that makes all this very hard to talk about now is after the 1970s, intellectual property law means that even commodities have rents tied into them. You're not just competing as pure commodities. Like, you have to have the right to produce X commodity unless it's a commodity whose development is over such certain amount of years old, and that keeps on getting extended into the future. So almost all commodities now also have rents in them.
I just, it just came to mind as well, like the estates of artists who are long since dead, but now you get like plates and notebooks and pillowcases and everything that you can possibly imagine, makeup palettes. I don't care. I don't know. Like their estates have begun to create sort of like new commodities that they never would have necessarily
Yeah,
their name on in the first place.
but they're only able to make those things commodities in so much that they're charging rents on the people producing the physical commodity.
Sure.
Like
Yes.
that's which means that the separation between commodities and rents, which is never absolute in the first place, I will add, but it is kind of assumed in Capital
I'm
Volume
thinking of,
1.
I guess it's called licensing, right?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
yeah.
That's a
okay.
rent.
Yeah, exactly. That's why it came to mind. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Licensing is a rent. And licensing involves more and more of the state. Now, one thing that we can maybe accuse Marx of not getting is how much the state was there all the way in the beginning. Like Colin Drum is always talking about, like, Marx treats markets as if they just naturally occur out of barter, and when you actually look at them, they have a cost. That cost is actually fronted by the state and our proto-state in most cases, but somebody's paying for it. The cost is like the guy who maintains the money tables. Like, so in that sense, this is a minor weakness of Marx. I don't think it changes a lot of the things that we're talking about, though.
Okay. Interesting.
Inevitable alternatives. Oh, wait, you still got more.
Wait. Base superstructure. I've heard as well on the theme that this is not Marx's own terminology, but it is certainly associated. Where does it come from? We obviously, Trotsky is outlining state organs which in relation to the economic foundation represent, quote, superstructure. Who first used this phrasing? Was it not Trotsky, I assume? What does he mean?
Absolutely not Trotsky.
What does he mean? Become a direct break on the social development, which
So,
you said they...
let me talk about it. Because it actually is in, I'm going to read the passage where that comes from.
Thank you.
All right. This is from a Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, 1859. In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, namely, the relation of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitute an economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, into which corresponds the definite forms of of social consciousness, not class consciousness. He actually doesn't use that term. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relationship of production, or, this merely to express the same thing in legal terms, with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From the forms of the productive forces, these relations turn into feathers. Thus begins an era of social revolution. The changes of economic foundation lead, sooner or later, to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. In studying such transformations, it is always necessary to distinguish between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of a natural science, and the legal, political, religious, artistic, and philosophic, in short, the ideological forms in which men become conscious of the conflict and fight it on. Just as one does not judge an individual by what he thinks about himself, so one cannot judge such a period of transformation by its consciousness. But on the contrary, this consciousness must be explained from the contradictions of material life, from the conflict existing between the social forces of production and the relations of production. Okay, now this is interesting because what Marx doesn't say is base.
Yes, but he
the
does
base
talk about superstructure.
He absolutely does talk about superstructure and does talk about how the material and social, and this is where it gets vague, okay? Because social life, social consciousness is not, it's economic, but that is a relationship of which law both inscribes and prescribes. So what he's describing here is a feedback loop. But all right, not a system where the base is solely determinative, because relations of production are part of the base, but they are defined by law, culture, habit, artistic creation, religious stuff, everything we call ideology. Sure. It's just that you can't understand it by your own self-explanation. You can't assume what people say about themselves is what is actually going on, even though we can assume they're being honest.
Yes.
It's not that they're lying. It's that they don't understand what the relationship is between this and that. And interestingly, it's implied that Marx is saying here, you can't know that at the time.
Sure. I found that section really like super interesting, actually. And that's like, I don't know. This is again, it's something that like reads in an interesting sort of psychological way.
Right. That's the
almost
only
surprised that he had access to that kind of knowledge or
right.
forethought.
What's interesting about here is the base determined superstructure requires like a whole lot of elements, aka the base is not just your like this is my problem with G.A. Cohen. All right. The base is not just your economic development level, it is also your relations of production.
Sure.
So you can't just say, oh, well, you have these stages of which Marx's history inevitably arises because of technological development. No, that's not what Marx is saying. Marx is saying social life, the way we relate to each other, is actually part of that material base. You cannot bracket it out. So that has a lot of implications. The superstructure develops unevenly in society's different activities, so it's not one thing. Mm-hmm. And the base superstructure relationship is reciprocal because of that whole stuff that I said about relations of production, which people forget.
Yes.
G.A. Cohen. And because of that, Engels says that the base determines the superstructure only in the last instance, and nobody fucking knows what that means.
Still?
Yeah. Like that's like like Engels's gloss on this when asked about it for Marx was like,
yeah,
like there's a relationship there. We would now call it something like a feedback loop.
Sure.
But it's only true that in the last instance does the base determine the superstructure, i.e., I guess it means when things that break down the material basis of society matters more. But until you're at that point, it's a feedback circle. All right. Which I guess is the most clear way. That's the way I've always interpreted that.
Yeah.
But that, like, you can interpret that in a whole lot of ways.
That's not the way that I hear it related to with any frequency. So
no, people actually do the vulgar Marxist thing and say that like the base is purely determinative of the superstructure. And I've been against this for years. It's a bad reading of Marx. It's not really. It leads one actually makes Marxism back into like a liberal version of Whigist history and technological development.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's the point. So yeah, I think that's an interesting thing with the base superstructure. But when people will say, oh, Marx didn't say that, he didn't use that word exactly, but he definitely said it.
He said it, and the other side is implied pretty clearly.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And then the last question that I had about this section is more kind of like about an entire body of Marxist work and theory. If we're not using the fall of Rome for an example,
it is unclear if Marx thinks that all these modes actually apply to societies that are not European.
Okay. What analogies like have been used in the Far East or in South America? Are they calling on the historical memory of the fall of Rome? I can only imagine that it's a little bit less interesting there.
One of the things that this leads to, it leads to the Asiatic despotism, tributary modes of production, feudalism debates.
Yeah.
Right? Which I've done a whole show on the feudalism debate. I haven't gotten to the tributary modes of production debate, which is Samir Amin's answer to this. And I'm going to have a guest come on to talk about the problems with Asiatic despotism, because Marx doesn't come up with any of these terms. He uses them, but he uses them. Part of it is I feel like Marx did not feel comfortable talking about non-European societies. So whenever he would speculate, like we in the Cito book, but it's come up a lot, which since the new left is like the letters to Vera Zulick, which are never sent. Yeah. Like And he doesn't send them because he feels uncomfortable with his conclusions. But his conclusions are something like, well, since capitalism has existed, this other form may be able to piggyback off the development of capitalism, but do it separately without having to go through a capitalist period. But they're still going to have to use capitalist technology, which I guess they would get from cooperation with socialists. And that doesn't, that since those letters are never sent, when like Plekhanov and co are debating that, because Marx wasn't the only person playing with that idea. There were other people. Some of the Narodniks were, I forget their exact names. Plekhanov goes, no, we have to develop capitalism because we're not going to have the means to do it now, and we can't, we have to have our own capitalism, and we also have to connect up with the socialists in the capitalist world for this to work.
Right.
Like, so basically, we have to catch up with them, and we need to join up with them. Our socialism's not going to be a viable project, which leads to the ironic position of Plekhanov advocating capitalism a lot, so that they can develop the forces to build socialism. This was also a debate in the Chinese context in the 1920s with the early Communist Party of China, and the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party before Mao. I can't remember their names right now. One of them was a proletarian thesis guy, and the other one was like, we're going to have to develop modes of production and catch up with the capitalist world and join up with Russia, and then through Russia join up with the rest of the world. And Mao kind of splits the difference between them.
Yeah.
So anyway,
interesting.
Because Mao's leadership was not, Mao becoming the leader of the Chinese Communist Party was because he was a good tactician. It wasn't because he was a theorist. Like,
he also had great hair. I was going to say that the only non-European countries that I can think of in Capital Volume 1 that are drawn upon are still colonies of European countries.
I mean, I will tell you one of the analogies that's often used is what I call Incan development, but they mention like the empires of Peru. Plekhanov mentions this particularly, as a way of developing forces through basically mass conscript cove labor, which is like not quite slavery but really close. And
is that corvée? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, corvée labor.
Yeah. Okay.
And he thought that like if you try to do socialism without going through capitalist development, without and since he wasn't thinking about piggybacking off of anybody, that massive corvée labor would be the only way to do it.
Interesting. Okay.
And he was always talking about the problems of like developing an empire like the Mayans, not the Mayans, the
Incans,
and such. We often refer to this as Incan development.
Sure.
But that's now, who really does do a lot of stuff on non-European societies? Marx gets interested in it at the end of his life because he gets interested in early anthropology. But Rosa Luxemburg did a lot on non-European societies. Yeah,
I didn't know that. Interesting.
She wrote a whole lot on what she was finding. Like, it's not like she went to places, but what she was finding out from like early 20th century anthropology, she was trying to incorporate that into their thought. So even in the European side, some people realized that this was a Europe-centric project. But yeah, one of the ways it was I mentioned tributary production. That doesn't happen until I think the 60s or 70s, but that's a mode where they try to get out of this because, basically they point out that there's all these like other empires that kind of like Rome, like and exist profitably for long periods of time and don't go to capitalism or feudalism. The Islamic hate empires, that's the main one, but sure. China prior to the Qing dynasty.
That's funny. I mean, because we also have like non-chattel slavery that never gets referenced, like the Mamluks.
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, Marx does mention non-chattel slavery, but nonetheless.
Okay. But like again in like a Roman context.
Yeah, or in like serfdom is not is like non-chattel slavery depending on the context of law.
Okay.
All right. So
last section for today.
So yeah, so last section. Inevitable alternatives. And we're going to get this in under 2 hours.
Yeah,
It's
we
funny.
are.
When we started this, guys, and I'm just going to remind people, we said these would be 15-minute episodes. And we might do like half an essay in 15 minutes. That never happened. All
Even
right.
though Varn speed reads, it still somehow doesn't work.
No, my kids complain about that too, that I read too fast. Like,
I mean, but that's like how you learned to get through such insane volumes of text so quickly.
yeah, I'm also a grader. You know how many shitty essays I read a day? It's amazing I can still write, because I'm like, that whole essay didn't have a noun.
God bless those children. They're
all
trying
adjectives and verbs. Or conversely, I didn't find a verb in this entire paragraph. Anyway, what is happening right now, kid?
They'll tell you like, adverbs and where stuff, but not what.
Yeah.
That's a good way to write fluff when you have no freaking idea what you're talking about.
The other way is to just use terribly punctuated passive voice construction.
I see people do that all the time who are adults. So
yeah. Oh, lawyers do it, but lawyers do it deliberately because it's the way not to express blame.
Yeah,
right?
That's why like mainstream media does it as well.
Yeah, but other people do it because it gets your word count up. So
Jesus.
Anyway,
well, good thing we got to the bottom of that.
So much is driven by word counts. Inevitable alternatives. This would seem to be a very particular explanation for the term inevitable, inescapable. First of all, Trotsky makes a distinction between historic inevitability and astronomical inevitability, astronomy being merely a representative of the so-called exact science. He cannot be making a distinction between the validity of the principle of determinism in one and the other field. He is recognizing the difference between our ability to establish inevitability in one or the other field. In the field of theory, Trotsky defines inevitability as the inescapability of one or the other of a number of limited alternatives. That is, he is merely establishing the existence of inevitable alternatives. I'm going to say that a lot of these physics analogies get a lot more complicated with post-1940s understandings of physics.
Yeah. Can't blame him for that, though. But
no,
still.
That's not his fault, but that's something we have to deal with.
Yeah.
Because linear causality is actually a lot harder when you start knowing about quantum mechanics.
I love this. I wonder if there will be one episode that we do on this essay that doesn't come up in. But it just keeps coming up. So
it has to. We have to also remind people that, like, hey, this is based off of a prior notion of physics. Like, because I don't want people to go like, oh, like Draper's an idiot. No, he's being pretty. I mean, for a guy with just which is like a humanities degree, he's pretty knowledgeable.
Yeah, and anyway, he's gonna like have like some incredibly prescient thought on heat death of the universe in 2 seconds here, and also to some degree like ecological disaster. So give him a break.
To be sure, it is legitimate to do so. In fact, in common parlance, the word inevitable is often meant to use in such context. Unless we make some terrible blunder, his election is inevitable. If reinforcements do not arrive, the army is doomed to defeat. As long as capitalism exists, war is inevitable, etc. But the existence of inevitable alternatives are, and Dubin has made fun of the fact that R and R or your and R for people who aren't me are different sounds. Not in my mouth, they're not. It's like aunt and aunt. They're all aunt to me.
Oh yeah, my dad's a New Yorker, so he has like a million ways to say words that are all homonyms to me. But like I'd say like berry for like putting someone in the ground, the fruit, the name with an A. Screw it.
Yeah, even stuff with a B, berry.
Yeah.
Anyway, but the existence of inevitable alternatives are the ability to establish their existence is not itself a distinction in a kind between history and astronomy or the exact sciences. To take Trotsky's astronomical example, the setting or rising of the sun is inevitable, unless the sun becomes a nova and converts the earth into a wisp of burnt ash. an
Love
event
that.
which might have a bearing upon the inevitability of socialism. Also, that's
True.
really funny.
It's
And also
that's my
true.
favorite parenthetical in the whole thing here. Like maybe that might get in the way of our whole idea and revolution.
Yeah, every now and then I'm like, this is pretty likely, except if we all got hit by a comet. This is
Yeah.
something that I say before I ever read this essay,
There
but
you go.
now I'm definitely going to bring it up.
Definitely. I also love just like it converts the earth into a wisp of burnt ash. That's just beautiful.
yeah. And since no astronomer can assure us that this cannot happen the day after tomorrow, and they still can't, it would seem that here too we have only alternatives from our human subjective point of view. There are differences between the two cases, but they are not as such to make Trotsky's formulation adequate. We can now characterize the nature of the Johnson formulation on the inevitability of socialism. Oh, we already skipped. I'm reading that. I'm reading the wrong thing. Sorry.
We're on the Trotsky's formulation. Screw Johnson's formulation.
Yeah,
we already decided that doesn't work.
Right. For Trotsky is saying that as socialism is inevitable unless barbarism runs out, then it would be equally true to say that barbarism is inevitable unless socialism wins out. A glass of water which is half full is the same as a glass of water which is half empty. We have therefore succeeded in establishing, following Trotsky's formulation, the inevitability of both socialism and barbarism, which is disconcerting since it proves too much and not enough. Or rather, to put the matter less paradoxically, all that Trotsky has really asserted here is the inevitability of the disjunction of socialism or barbarism, and not at all the inevitability of socialism, which is in effect abandoned. This is, in fact, the approach that Professor Sidney Hook chose to take to the question in his book Towards an Understanding of Karl Marx, written while he was still considered himself a Marxist. He gave up being a Marxist in 1938 or 1939, and he found the Committee for Cultural Freedom, which is later picked up by the OSS. He doesn't find it with the OSS, but later it's picked up by the OSS, becomes the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which recruits a whole lot of former Trotskyists into the Cold War, basically.
Cool. That answered one of my questions about this section.
Yep. All right.
Yeah.
We are now in the position to understand what Marx really meant when he speaks of the historical inevitability of communism. Communism is not something fated to be realized in the nature of things, but if society is to survive, communism offers the only way out of the impasse created by the inability of capitalism, despite the superabundance of wealth, to provide a decent social existence for its own wage earners. What Marx is really saying is either this, communism, or nothing, barbarism. This is why communists feel justified in claiming that their doctrines express both the subjective class interest of the proletariat and the objective interest of civilization. The objectivity of Marxism is derived from the truth of the disjunction. The subjectivity from the fact that this is chosen rather than nothing. Normally, a recognition of the truth of this disjunction carries with it a commitment to communism. But the connection is not a necessary one any more than the knowledge that milk is a wholesome drink makes one a milk drinker. It is only when one accepts the first term of the disjunction, which is a psychological and, if you please, ethical act, that he has a right to the name of Marxist, emphasis in the original.
That's really funny. Sorry about your embrace of milk.
Yeah.
That doesn't hold out, buddy. Better ways to get calcium.
The reader will note that the conclusion to which Hook directly derives Trotsky's formulation is the acceptance of socialism is a moral choice, and this is still a big fucking debate amongst Marxists. Whether or not this is a normative choice or a descriptive one, and if it is a normative choice, is it normative because it prevents the end of civilization, or is it normative as a morality?
Yeah. That's an interesting distinction as well.
Right. This is the one of the observations from which tends to derive the
epigons. I had to look that word up today.
Into frenzy. That's a word that I see and like know what it means, but
Yeah.
have literally never said in my life.
Sure, of course.
Like this is good practice of reading shit out loud. You can tell I teach high school because
Yeah.
I don't read stuff with that
I
in
could
it anymore.
easily imagine myself pronouncing that like it was like a Greek word, like
Yeah, I was about to.
epigenes.
Is it epigones?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
no,
There
it's
you
not
go.
because it's not an
Epigone.
it's
Yeah,
not
epigone.
italicized. So that was back when we
Yes.
did cool things like make sure we italicized foreign words so we knew to pronounce it weird.
Yeah.
All right.
That's it weird. Love that. That's the difference. See, it's just gotta make it weird.
Indeed, it is a conclusion to draw not from Trotsky's inadequate interpretation of the meaning of the inevitability formula, but from his assertion of the existence of historic alternatives. And if it is not taken in the context of which Hook here gives it, and not given by the Hook of today, which is like, yeah, we know he's a traitor.
Yeah.
The
He doesn't
conclusion
have the
is
right to name himself a Marxist anymore by his standards or any
right.
of them.
The conclusion is unobjectionable. With all this behind, we can now turn to a positive analysis of the meaning of the formula inevitability of socialism. Even so, some ground still has to be cleared. And we have now about 1/3. No, we're more than 1/3.
According to the web page that I'm reading this from, we are very much halfway now.
Okay, we're about 50% through this article. I swear I thought I could do this in like an hour and 4 50-minute chunks.
It was aspirational, a bit delusional, and we're all subject to that. All right, before we wrap it up here, and we can still definitely
Your questions, madam.
I have a few. Thank you, sir. I find it really interesting because he's regarding, Trotsky's historical versus astronomical distinction of inevitability, the astronomical inevitability of the sun rising and setting. But earlier, he uses meteorology, and that's supposed to be kind of like a newfangled science where we have a really good amount of like objective knowledge, but still.
But it's probabilistic, and
right.
probability is a problem. So
Absolutely, and we can't really know everything at that point in time, at least, and maybe still today, that goes into all of the different factors that are at play, the complexity that leads to rain or sunshine or a hurricane or not. Like, do you think that he's using meteorology and astronomy here, like purposefully to make a distinction?
because
with
at the time,
science?
meteorology is like a hard science, but it's not an exact science. That's why he keeps on saying exact sciences, where astronomy is supposed to be an exact science, meaning we can calculate where a star is from like hard math.
And yet he said we still don't really know, like scientists don't know if tomorrow the sun will become a nova, explode. And you said that that's still the case?
Yes, still the case. We don't know what causes novas.
Or when they're going to happen or
when they're going to
whatever.
happen. Although
by the time we notice it, it's way too late as well.
I was about to say, we do have more knowledge of like what would cause the sun to like become a red giant in a star's life cycle. And like, just to remind people that this is in 1947. In 1890, there was not even a real like astronomical distinction between stars and planets.
Right.
Like, I was reading a children's textbook from like 1895 once, and I got to the astronomy section and I was confused because stars and planets were used interchangeably.
That's funny. What about, now we have dwarf planets too. Sorry, Pluto.
Yeah.
That's such like a stupid old reference to make.
Dwarf planet.
Zoomers. Once upon a time, there was a planet called Pluto. It's not a planet.
Well, here's
anymore.
the problem: if you accept dwarf planet as a planet, you also have to add like 900 planets to the solar system.
Just do it. Just
like,
make things harder.
Which was my answer. Is like, okay, well, just add all of them. Fuck, we don't have to memorize them all. We just need to know they're there.
We have plenty of Greek gods left as well.
What I find funny is like people go, "That's not scientific. It is scientific." I'm like, it's semantic. It's not even an actual scientific argument. It's a semantic argument. It's about definitions.
Sure, it doesn't make them exist or not. We're not taking them out of the sky by giving them
but
a
also
name.
like it's not been settled by a scientific argument. It's been settled by a scientific body refining a definition. It wasn't like they proved anything either way.
No,
it was that if it was basically that, well, if we don't refine the definition some, we're going to have too many objects that we call planets in our solar system.
Sure.
So
That's funny. I'm really into plants, for example, and like they get recategorized all the time. And
yeah,
nothing about them changes and nobody cares except for people who have, their garden organized in a certain way. That's it. They're the ones who get salty
right.
about it.
So I do think that's going on there. It's also like interesting. Yeah, what other like antinomies do we see here?
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a danger with you sending me the questions ahead of time because I kind of know what you.
It's not a danger. It's a beautiful thing. I would rather pretend that we have like the escape to Witch Mountain twin kind of like telepathy thing going on, but fine if you want to blow that. I just wanted to ask about the subjective class interests of the proletariat and the objective interests of civilization. But I think it's like actually a little bit more apparent, especially to anyone who's read any Marxist text. We can take a second on
class consciousness gets redefined so many different ways too. I mean, like particularly once you get past like Lukash's history and class consciousness, what it means becomes like whatever the fuck people want to say it means. Like class consciousness is the inevitability of like the consciousness of the proletariat is manifested by anyone.
Yeah.
But we know it because of the science of revolution, whatever the fuck that means. Like, one of the things about this period of Marxism is like Lukashian terminology has not become dominant yet, even though, like, not that Lukács made just stuff up. Like Marx talks about consciousness and whatnot. It's just a different thing. One of the things, so the older new science is interesting because, and I knew you were going to ask about that because, what Draper is talking about is like new discoveries in physics versus relying off of like Aristotelian understanding of science.
Sure.
But the thing is that our Newtonian understanding of science. But the thing is, by the time that you get to the 1950s, like even that's complicated. So he's actually using what we would consider an old scientific model. Does David complicate this or improve upon it later? I don't know. Actually, I haven't read all of Draper.
Yeah.
I've read Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, that big block of books. I've read the theory, the dictatorship of the proletariat from Marx to Lenin. I've read what is it, the myth of revolutionary defeatism, and I've read a couple of polemics, and I've read a lot of his students. And interesting, Draper students are all over the place. Our Draper's like comrades. So like Wayne Price becomes a Marxist anarchist. He was a guy who was tied to Draper. Ron Tabor becomes an anti-Marxist, he also was not attached to Draper, but attached to one of the groups Draper founded. But also like a lot of the monthly review, which we normally associate with like pro-China, slightly pro-Marxist-Leninist, they also have a direct tie to Draper, interestingly. So, and Draper was fundamental to the International Socialist Organization, but that group became associated later, not with Draper and Shachtman, who were the people who they were originally associated with. It becomes associated with the tendency in Britain called the Cliffite tendency, which was similar. It had a similar understanding of state capitalism, but Draper actually believes in bureaucratic collectivism. So, at least at this point, I think he does change over the state capitalism, but I don't know when.
Interesting.
So,
we'll have to find out.
Yeah, all these divisions only matter if you're a Trotskyist, though. If you're a Maoist, there are other divisions that are really important and just as confusing.
Well, we'll be getting to those too in this
eventually.
A very long, exciting excavation, digging deeper into the earth.
Yeah, this is basically what we do these days. Is me throwing like, "Hey, we're going to talk about all these weird texts that no one talks about very much," because I consider this like critical Marxism, like 300. Like most people get stuck in 101, which is not that we should denigrate 101, but like it's like, oh, we're gonna read State and Revolution on a show again. Woo! Let's get into these like debates more than just the key text, because you need to know what the debates were.
Sure. And what are we going to do if not like just rehash the old canon, but take part in debate, which is how we move things forward in any meaningful way.
Like just reading Lenin again over and over is only going to get you so far if you're not reading all the stuff Lenin was responding to. So yeah, I mean, subjective class interests of the proletariat versus the objective interests of civilization. I think like the objective interest of civilization as we survive and make stuff. And the subjective interest of the proletariat is the removal of class constraints.
Got to get rid of those fetters.
But one thing that makes Marxists very uncomfortable is to say that the commitment to Marxism is a moral choice. Like that's a huge debate. I think we should probably give a little bit of background on Sidney Hook. Sidney Hook became associated with pragmatism, and he was a social democrat even after he breaks with Marxism. And he like was avidly against democratic centralism. And he was one of these anti-totalitarian speakers. Democratic centralism is the principle held up from the Second International, which says that criticism is okay internally, but don't let the criticism be known outside, and democracy is to be upheld, but only like, but what the party says is kind of like what the party's consensus is, as long as it comes from a democratic concession within the party, is absolute. Which is why
that's wild. That sounds familiar in a modern sense.
Yeah, that is a Marxist-Leninist sticking point agreed to by Trotskyists, by Maoists, by old school Marxist-Leninist, aka Stalinist, by most social democrats. Even like one of the reasons why we didn't know Kautsky's opinion on the war credits is because he abstained as to not, and then also it was not recorded except for the outcome of the vote as to not create factions. Even though factions were allowed in the Second International, they like whatever the decision of the conference was binding.
Gotcha. Okay.
So anyway, he's associated with the New School for Social Research. That has an interesting history, trying into a bunch of German things, and he was also really strongly associated with Marxism. He even conducted research at the Marx Engels Institute in Moscow in 1929. He was a supporter of the Soviet Union. He supported the CPUSA's leading candidate, William Z. Foster. William Foster ran for president of the United States, and back before the Popular Front ended the Communist Party running its own presidential candidates, which I don't think it's done since then. And with James Burnham, Sidney Hook forms the American Socialist Party, which is, the American Workers' Party, with A.J. Musty. And he became an ardent Second Internationalist and anti-communist, but considered himself a good socialist. But he does actually kind of turn against Marxism. He called himself an anti-communist socialist, and he was like a humanist manifesto guy and an American pragmatist. And he started the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which became the American Committee for Cultural Freedom, which becomes part of the Congress for one of the things that that Burnham uses later with the OSS to actually fight communism in Europe intellectually. And they recruit a lot of former Trotsky, well, not just former Trotskyists, actually. They recruit a lot of former Marxists in general, former Social Democrats, former Trotskyists. Later on, Maoists would get recruited to this. And they are Social Democrats in the 50s and 60s, but they become conservatives in the 70s and 80s. Not that Hook does. Hook does not. But Hook remains like, he sees like what he's advocating for is like, he would probably be like a Bernie Sanders supporter today.
That's kind of what it sounds like. That's interesting.
But he was working with the OSS to fight communists. So just, put all that in
that man must
perspective.
have been at utter war with himself.
But his writings before 1939, most Marxists actually think are pretty good.
I mean, what we were reading just now at the end of this section, where we'll leave it for today, it's called Toward the Understanding of Karl Marx. At one point in time, that was pretty central to his project. Yeah, and it sounds like he helped people do that. So,
I would say, his books, Towards an Understanding of Karl Marx, Christianity and Marxism, The Meaning of Marx, and From Hegel to Marx, are pretty good. But what's interesting is he considered himself a pragmatist even before he became a Marxist. And he always had a relationship to John Dewey, so it kind of makes sense that that's where he goes in 1939. Gotcha. Is like, we're going to try to do socialism, but we're going to like have a mild criticism of Marx, and then like we're going to be avid anti-communist. And American pragmatist socialism was what they were on offer. So, he's one of the reasons, frankly, why Trotskyism is associated with neo-conservatism. The big things are the students of Max Shachtman in the 60s, who Michael Harrington's one of, but the ones who don't go into the Democratic Socialist of America, which later becomes the Social Democrats of America, which later becomes the Democratic Socialist of America, the DSA. Those people, that group, is where most of the modern socialist tendencies in the United States kind of actually come from. What is interesting is in the United States, there aren't that many currently existing parties which do not have a Trotskyist history outside of the CPUSA.
Yeah.
The Revolutionary Communist Party US, which was the first Maoist party. And then descendants of those splits, which there are a bunch. And then the Progressive Labor Party was also a Marxist-Leninist party.
So we're really lucky to have Hal Draper to read, because first of all, he's in English and there's no issue of translation. But like, it brings to the forefront why all of these claims of and calling people trots today, it's kind of really silly in an American context.
Yeah, because even the anti-revisionist parties, the PSL and the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and the World Workers' Party, which were both parties associated with the Sam Marcy split from the Fourth International.
And if you want to hear more about this and watch me make strange, confused faces, go back and re-listen to episode 1.
They were all Trotskyist parties. There are other Maoist parties in the United States, but none of them really, very few of them exist now. There was, I forget which party it was, the Delonist Socialist Party, which was a pre-Trotsky split from the Socialist Party of America, which was the party of Daniel Delone and his separate IWW, his because the Delonists were sectarians. And so in American socialism, there's actually a split before the Comintern and the second and the first and second, in the second and third international split. Okay. So there's actually one that goes before 1919, which is when everything else splits. And it survived until the 2000s. I think it finally shuttered its doors in like 2008 or 2009 or something. But it was around, like when I was in my 20s, it still existed. Like when I was like in the wilderness looking for political parties, like when I was, when I was like waking up to Marxism after my period of neoconservatism, I actually considered joining it, but it was barely around. but like it
That's
still
wild.
formally existed. And
Everyone in the comments, write your favorite sect slash
yeah,
cult slash
yeah,
one that you would
that
like to
still
revive
exists.
from the dead.
Um,
Let's see
I
what we
mean,
can do.
what's weird is like there's a lot of them that formally still exist but have very, very small membership, like the
Yeah.
US, the Socialist Workers Party, the original Trotskyist party in the United States, technically still exists as the Pathfinder tendency.
That's so funny. Are they like, they're like, we're the hardcore. You
No,
can't
they're
rip
not
us
the
apart.
hardcore because they take they're Soviet defensist, and they start taking a like they write this polemic called Our Trotsky and Theirs in the 1970s, and they use it to justify supporting Castro. And so that actually leads to a bunch of splits because Castro's in league with the Soviet Union, and then you have to deal with all the stuff like what makes it even more complicated. If you're a Soviet defensist but you think it's a deformed worker state or whatever, what do you do with the Sino-Soviet split, which becomes an even bigger problem?
Sure.
And then I still, for the life of me, couldn't figure out, like, after 1992 happens, why are there still Trotskyist parties?
That's so funny. I'm going to write my first essay is going to be called You're Not My Real Trotsky.
Like,
Jesus.
There
Anyway.
is this sort of like there's a Schrodinger's Mao, like when someone calls them a Maoist, they actually don't know that much about them. It's like, what period of Mao are you pulling from?
Yeah.
There's like this with like, which version of Trotsky are you pulling from? Like, whose reconstruction of Trotsky is yours? Like, because my stance about all this is important to know, but none of it's particularly relevant now. Like, it doesn't make sense to be a trot or unless you're formally aligned with the Chinese or Vietnamese state to call yourself like I'm a proper Orthodox Marxist Leninist. Yeah, I don't even think they're like all the Marxist Leninist states have their own formal official ideologies that are different now anyway.
Also,
like there's like
you can keep the aesthetics, guys. It's fine. No one's
like,
going to take it away from you.
Juche and Ho Chi Minh thought and current CPC thought are all different from like 1947 or 1938 Marxist Leninism. Like, come on.
Well, to keep this under that 2-hour mark, and
we're gonna stop here.
Tread the conversation that we should have had in that Patreon episode about non-sectarianism. I think we stop now.